Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a great weekend and you're ready to get this one going. And we will get it started by continuing to look at the 78th Psalm. Since we've had a little weekend break, just to remind you again, this Psalm is written from for the purpose of encouraging the people of Israel and ultimately you and I to remember the faithfulness of God, remember the failures of others, of our ancestors, and not repeat those same mistakes. Israel, again, we've talked about this numerous times. They're a picture of inconsistency in their walk with the Lord. One day they are they're going to the temple. They're doing everything by the book. The next day they are marrying the Canaanites and worshiping Baal, and they're just back and forth. And so Asaph is challenging the people to be consistent, to eliminate this wandering that they tend to do, and he's doing that by again he's replaying for them their history. Replaying for them largely the story of the Exodus, a story that every little Jewish boy and girl would have heard from their parents, from their grandparents. Was something that was talked about. They had festival days, feast days, celebrations, remembering certain events that took place during that time. And so it was certainly a well-known story to them, but Asaph is using it and pulling out the spiritual part of it to show them again how that the children of Israel stood on, again, one side of the Red Sea and murmured and complained that God had brought them out of Egypt and going to let them die till he divided the Red Sea and took them across. And then they had a celebration for a little while until they were hungry, until they were thirsty, and then they started complaining until he gave them bread and water. And then they celebrated for a little while. And so he's using this over and over as an example to them of how their ancestors did things and saying, let's not us make the same mistake. And so we're going to pick up in verse 55 of that story. And he tells them here, he reminds them, he says, he cast out the heathen also before them and divided them an inheritance by line and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. And so this verse this morning, Asaph, again, he has, if you go back through the first 54 verses in different places, different ways. Again, he has brought up the story of the Exodus of the children of Israel leaving, coming out of Egyptian bondage and coming into the promised land. And he hasn't obviously in 54 verses recounted everything in the story. But he has hit on several different pieces of the story. In particular, again, their tendency to go back and forth between being model believers and then to the other extreme. And so he has hit that. And then he says in verse 55, and I think it would be appropriate if this verse started with the word but. Even after all this back and forth, this literal wandering through the wilderness, but more this spiritual wandering that the Israelites have done, says you could easily insert the word but he cast out the heathen before them. Even though they did these things, even though they were inconsistent, even though they were often completely belligerent towards God, out and out questioning his love, his compassion, his power, um, preferring Egypt over the promised land. There were times when, if you go back and you read through the book of Exodus, for example, you'll see that there are times when the Israelites are just, I guess the term spiritually belligerent. They are, if I put it this way, if earthly speaking, if we would have talked to or about our parents the way they talked about their spiritual father, most of us would have, we'd have got knocked out. But he drove out the heathen from before them. It says, out of his mercy, out of his love, out of his compassion, he continues to be good to the Israelites. He continues with his plan to bring them into the promised land. If you go back and you read the book of Exodus, you'll see that at any number of points along the way, from Egypt to the promised land, and any number of points along the way, if God would have come to the place where He said of Israel, "I quit, I give up, I'm done with y'all, I've had enough." And I'm fed up with it. I quit. Y'all just wander in the wilderness, or here's a drought, a famine, a heat storm in the desert that's going to kill all of you. If at any point in the story we read that, we wouldn't be. I don't think we'd be too surprised. I don't think we'd say, well, what in the world? God having a bad day? I think we would probably read the story. And if we saw something like that in the story, we'd say, well, they had it coming. It was about time. Popeye, the old Popeye cartoon, Popeye said, say, I've had all I can stands and I can't stands no more. Israel pressed and pressed and pressed and pushed God and just continually tried their luck. Yet he cast out the heathen before them. And unbelievably, we're going to continue to read in this psalm as we continue to move forward. And they continue, even after, when they finally do get to the promised land, they continue to go back and forth and to do these things. And so, in this verse, God gives them the promised land anyway. He gives them their inheritance as it's described here in this verse. And it says he makes the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. What he's saying is he gave Israel, he gave the Israelites the homes of the people who belonged of Canaan. And so even despite their continual denial, turning back from following God, He gives them the promised land, blesses them anyway. Again, remember, this group that went into the promised land had seen their parents die in the wilderness because of their unbelief. If you remember the story, the Israelites come out of Egypt and they get to the Jordan, they get to the edge of the promised land, they send the spies in, and 10 of the spies come out and say the land's full of giants, we can't take it, we'll never be able to defeat them. Joshua and Caleb say, no problem, God can, we're going to take this promised land. The people obey or listen, agree with the 10 and say, we don't want to go, we're scared, we don't want to go in. And God says, okay, then you won't go in. And so all the adults at that point, he says, you're going to die in the wilderness before I take my people into the promised land. And so all these people now who are going into the promised land know that story. How their parents died in the wilderness because of their unbelief. They also know that when they did get into the promised land, that God did what he said he would do. They know that their parents were wrong. Because when they do go into the promised land, God drives them out, gives them the land, gives them their homes, just as He had promised to Abraham. And He divides the land out and gives it to them and puts it into their hands. And they know all this. And we're going to read as we continue in this psalm that in spite of that, they continually uh, deny him. They continually go against him and fight against God and go contrary to his word, even though they know they have witnessed their parents suffer for unbelief, and they have been blessed and brought into the promised land, and they have seen God operate. They have seen him move. And so they have seen both sides of the coin here. They've seen disobedience and the cost. They have seen the power of God and what He is doing or He can do, and yet they still continue and they choose to be disobedient. It's a sad story. It really, really is. But unfortunately, it's a familiar story. That's the story of the Israelites going into the promised land. It's not that far different from our story. We have witnessed both in the lives of others, and we have experienced ourselves the discipline, the chastising of God for disobedience. We have experienced the blessings of God, the sweetness of our walk with Him when it is what He desires for it to be. We have experienced the joy of our salvation, as the New Testament calls it, and we have experienced the pain of disobedience, and yet. Many times we still choose to be disobedient. We choose to go against the Word of God, against the will of God, when we know, just like the Israelites know, the benefit of obedience. And so this morning, as we finish up, I just want to encourage you um, as Asaph did the people of Israel, remember, don't forget what God has done. Don't forget, the discipline, the things we have seen. I'm not going to go into great details because I don't. Some may still know some of the characters involved in the story. But just to make it simple, there is an incident in my life back all the way back to my childhood where some people were very cruel, very mean to to a pastor, to their pastor. And even as a young child, I remember. I'm just going to again. I'm going to be vague to protect the, as the police shows to protect the innocent here. But I remember as a child seeing a couple of the real ringleaders of what went on suffer and suffer extensively physically in their life, and I remember that, and I don't forget that. You don't mess with God's people. You don't mess with God's man. I learned that lesson. Unfortunately, there's also a whole lot of stories I could tell you of times when I haven't learned my lesson, and I went back and repeated the same mistake and made the same error again. And so I hope you take this psalm and what we've come through so far as an encouragement, as a reminder to regularly, to daily seek the hand of God, to seek the will of God, to seek the direction of God, so that your life, so that you and those around you can be blessed, can experience the joy again of our salvation through uh, obedience. I'll close and remind you of the words of the old hymn. I love the old hymn. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. All right, you have a good day, and we will see you back here tomorrow morning.